susirinkę į mūsų pirmą ciklo Subalansuotas miestų tankinimas paskaitą. Šiandien jį vyks anglų kalba. Kaip matote, ją skaitys lektoriai iš Švedijos. Tiesiog noriu pradžioje pasakyti, kad ciklą organizuoja Architektūros kokybės vystymo asociacija. Be finansavimo Lietuvų kultūros tarybos ir UAB ACO Nordic mes negalėjome šito dalyko įgyvendinti ir tikrai laukiam to finansavimo, nes jau buvo ciklas suplanuotas. O žinoma, mūsų partneris žurnalas Statyba ir architektūra ir jų portalas sa.lt remia mūsų informacinį sklaidoj ir po paskaitos bus publikuotas ir trumpas straipsnis ir taip pat, kaip matote, vyksta įrašas ir jis bus vėliau skelbtas YouTube kanale. So now I'm switching to English. Today we're welcoming Mette Berghauser Pont from Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg. And she is a professor of urban morphology and urban design and leads the research group Spatial Morphology group, which is engaged in research in areas of urban morphology, space syntax, and design theory. Mette has gained her PhD in Delft University of Technology, Netherlands. Later, she worked for a few years at KITH, that is Royal Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and the Built Environment in Stockholm. And most time she spent at Chalmers University of Technology. And she published over 100 scientific publications and also took part in 24 projects. But most important, her publication is a book, Space Matrix, Space Density and Urban Form. Who didn't read this book, it is an open source book. Please find on the internet after the lecture. And in this book, she, together with co-author, please help me. Perhaupt, yes. They researched concept of density, but with a critical attitude. And this book specifies in relationship between density and urban form, as well as environmental, economic, and social effects of the density. So it's you can see that Mette is a real expert in the field. So I'm finishing here, and Mette, you are welcoming to the floor.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction to my work. I will share my screen and start, but I just want to check because we have like almost 2 hours. So I will probably halfway somewhere we have a break of 15 minutes, I suppose. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah. So I will share my screen. There. You see it full screen now?
Yes.
Good. So what I will try to do is to take you along, let's say, in this journey that I have gone through in, let's say, kind of all my career, working with density and densification. And I will do so through a kind of a few different sort of lenses. But to start off, I think we should, let's say, density has been and is still one of the key planning variables, you could say. We have been discussing this for more than 100 years when we talk about cities and how they should develop. And also currently, as you know, UN Habitat has prescribed kind of a minimum density actually to to achieve sustainable development goals. And this is different from 100 years ago, when we actually said there was a maximum of density. Density was actually a problem. And now we live in a world where we see density as the solution, which is kind of interesting. And also partly the reason that we thought that on the one hand, we need to understand really what density is, what it actually means in terms of built environment characteristics, but also in terms of how it affects our life. But also to really go through what are the pros and cons, and to be very honest about those. Because we tend, let's say, if you look historically, we tend to sort of hope for the perfect solution and then we just run with it, but forget that there might be drawbacks. So let's say my whole work is sort of going about trying to really understand what it means in terms of architecture or in terms of the built environment, and to really understand how it impacts our life, but also lives of other species that have to live and survive. So that's kind of the background. And I will go through it. Let's say first I will take a kind of I go back in time a little bit and really to start and understand where are we today in comparison where we were 100 years ago, to be able to understand also where are we going to. So to look a little bit into the future. That's number one. Then the second part is to talk about this a huge survey that I did with a few colleagues to really look into the effects of density. The third part will be to relate density to urban form. And that is let's say that was the core of the Space Matrix books, the first edition. And then I will close off, this is a very short part, number 4, to say that density is not enough to really understand what kind of urban life we can have. So that I will end with that. And if you have, let's say, questions, I propose you put them in the chat somehow, and we take them, let's say, after the first half of the talk. I can go through them, or you can ask, let's say, by raising your hand, and then I will, after the second part of the talk, I will do the same. So let's go back in time, and I take one city as an example. I take Amsterdam, but I think there would be many cities in Europe that have the same sort of, where you see the same trends. What you see here in this image is, in red is the size of the city at the time of this image. It's 1650. And then you see two diagrams. One is showing the urban footprint. So how much land each citizen in Amsterdam has at its disposal. And you see it was about 17 square meters. So each person in Amsterdam had 17 square meters of land to live, work, move around. So everything is included there. It's like you can compare it with what is talked about at times, the ecological footprint. There you also include what land do you need for food production, etc. But this is, let's say, purely the urban footprint. Then you see the other diagram with the line in red, which is just simply showing the density in terms of inhabitants per hectare in Amsterdam. And then you see the time sequence here. So I will go through this and give you a few time snaps of Amsterdam. So 1650, Amsterdam had about 700 inhabitants per hectare in this red area. And then the city sort of expands. And because it expands, the density drops at first, but then actually people move in again, so it goes up again. So you see this is a trend that sort of every city has probably gone through at different periods of time. This is then in the middle of the Industrial Revolution in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands, where you see that a lot of people move in, and you see the densities go up again, let's say from 1820 until 1880. But then after that, in 1900, since 1900, you see it starts dropping. It goes down, and the city expands, and it drops even further. You see that green areas are added, industrial areas are added, and the city grows and grows. And in 2000, we had less than 100 inhabitants per hectare. And we started in 1650 when it was 700 almost. So it dropped quite dramatically in those years. And only the last 20 years, there is a slight increase. This is really a change in the trend that we have had for more than 100 years. It starts increasing, and that it does so on a city level is a quite heavy increase. And this, I would say, is the result of all the policies that have been around for approximately 20 years now about densification, even more, I would say 25 years. That densification is an answer to the current problems of our cities and societies. And this is kind of a result of that. You saw also on the left side this bar that we started with 17 square meters of land per person. Currently, we have 160 almost. Also, you see this enormous increase. It's like 10th times as much land per person is needed for the things we do in cities currently. And here you see the same graphs again, let's say, through time. So you see the density drops and the urban footprint increases tremendously, except for, let's say, you see the change in the trend since 2000. And I would say that the time when these shifts occur, they differ from city to city in Europe, but there are, let's say, you will see approximately similar trends. And if we zoom out and we say that, okay, is this just, let's say, Amsterdam, or is it just Europe, or is this something that is global? I borrow some work of another researcher, Angel, and he showed that actually in many cities, if you look over time, you see a decrease in density. This doesn't go back as far as I went back in time. This is starting in 1800 approximately. But you see that most of the cities actually have an increasing trend, a decreasing trend in terms of the amount of inhabitants per hectare. So this is a general trend. And we should therefore also see the plea for higher densities from this perspective. We have actually been decreasing density to an enormous level. So it was maybe indeed time to sort of start increasing density. And I will go back, let's say, to why we should do that. But if we look a little bit more, let's say, why have our cities become so less? So why did this decrease in density occur? And there are various reasons for that, and I will give you a few. One is, of course, that the average occupation rate, so how many people live in each house, has been decreasing, and that is a trend that has been ongoing quite, let's say, for a long time. I think Sweden currently is about 1.7 persons per, or 1.6 even persons per dwelling on an average. While, let's say, 100 years ago, that for sure was 4 or 5 persons per dwelling. And you can imagine, let's say, that means that you need 3 times as many houses to house the same amount of people. And each of these houses, if it's not stacked on top of each other, needs a little bit of land. The other thing that has happened is that our cities have changed in terms of how they are organized and which kind of land uses we have. And you can't read what this all is, but all these lines represent one land use. And the one that goes steepest up is green areas. So we have actually been adding a lot of green areas. I cannot claim that it has happened in all cities in Europe. This is the example of Amsterdam again. But this is something that we also have seen, and that has to do with the view that changed in 1900 that we should see our cities need to have green areas to actually support well-being and health of its citizens. And then we started adding this. We also added a lot of industrial areas, a lot of transport areas, let's say a lot more infrastructure our cities are having at the moment than if you look 100 years ago, etc., etc. So this has also, of course, because on all these other land uses that are not housing or industry, of course, has buildings, but many land uses are empty in terms of buildings. So that means that this land is well, if you include that in the calculations of inhabitants per hectare, your numbers will drop because you have a lot of areas that are of other kind. important. I'm not saying that they are not important, but that's the other reason. And then there is also has been a trend for many, many years. Also there we see a shift, but dwellings in general have become much larger. So we live with less people in each dwelling. The dwellings are bigger, and we have a lot of other land uses surrounding these buildings. And all that sort of added up in decreasing densities. And this happens, let's say, not equally around the city. This is an example of 2 areas in Amsterdam. And you see the inhabitants per hectare, how it develops over the years. And you see that this example is the, how shall I translate? It's the canal city. So if you have been in Amsterdam, you probably have been there, because that's what Amsterdam is known for. It's this, let's say you have these circular canals with nice buildings along it that have a kind of stable number of inhabitants per hectare. It dropped a bit, let's say, since 1900, but then it has been stable. Then we have another area, which is the Jordaan, which is very close to that one, also very popular now as a tourist place. And that had a very, very high number of inhabitants per hectare. It were the slums of Amsterdam at that time, 1880. But has since then been gentrified. So a lot of dwellings has been sort of being, so first maybe it was a house with like 8 dwellings, and they have been bought up by 1 person, and there's 1 family living in the whole house at the moment. So this area has dropped tremendously in the number of inhabitants per hectare, while actually the physical form, let's say all the buildings are still there. It's not so that they demolished and built something new. All the buildings are still there, but they just changed how they are used currently. And this, good. So these are pictures of the Jordaan at let's say what I said were the slums of Amsterdam in 1880. Let me see if I can. And this is a picture of one of the pandemics that went through many cities at that time. And there, what was seen is that the number of deaths was much higher in those areas with a very, very, very high number of inhabitants per hectare in comparison to neighborhoods that had far less high density. And this has triggered, amongst other things, a discussion about, okay, how should we not sort of start planning our cities that we can avoid this? So this has triggered a lot of regulations over, let's say, throughout Europe. And these are examples of that. So for instance, regulations about guidances, how when a street width has a certain width, then the building should have a certain height. Sort of that there is a balance between these two, with the reason to have enough fresh air being able to go through, let's say, getting into these buildings, to have daylight access, etc. So these kind of regulations starting to pop up, and this goes fast. And of course, this has repercussions or effects on the density if you put limitations here. This is an example from Berlin. They also have these kind of guidelines. They have guidelines about how the coverage of the buildings on a plot. So you cannot build the whole plot. You have to have like it's maximum 50% or something. And there were these studies of daylight access, and a famous example of Gropius, so that if you build higher, you put them further apart, and actually you can then start calculating the density, and we'll see that actually building higher does not always give you a higher density. There were also more sort of theoretical ideas about let's say how whole cities should develop, and the Garden City movement of Ebenezer Howard is a very good example of that. And they discussed both, let's say, the building types, the neighborhood development, but also how these neighborhoods could grow to a certain extent, and then it should stop, and you should have land and agricultural land, and then a new city could pop up. So they had this, was even a regional idea about how cities should develop. So you had this, all this happened at the same time around around 1900. So there were a lot of these kind of discussions and ideas. Okay, how do we make a good city? This is one of these quotes from that time, nothing gained by overcrowding. And they actually claimed and proposed that 12 dwellings to the acre should be the maximum. And that is 30 dwellings per hectare. That is approximately 60 inhabitants per hectare. And compare that to what UN Habitat says today at the minimum of 150 inhabitants per hectare. So you see this sort of it's a complete shift in how we see how our cities should be developed. Le Corbusier is another example, also from the, let's say, in the same time he came with these ideas, but wait. He's in a way he said you can actually build very dense without these repercussions or problems with daylight, with fresh air, etc., by building high-rise in the park. And this has been sort of you have these examples in your cities. We have them in Sweden, we have them in Amsterdam. We know, but this was revolutionary, you could say, at the time. Now we see it in a very different daylight, but at the time this was something completely new, that you could see a city as being towers in a park setting. Jane Jacobs is another of these examples that came, let's say, as a reaction to all this. Low densities, high rise in parks would kill the life in cities. I will not say so much more, but I will get back to it at the end of my talk. Where are we today? So we have other problems. So if we had issues of overcrowdedness in European cities, issues of unhealthy situations, issues of very little open space, very compact urban environments. Currently, the big questions we have to work with is the planetary boundaries, as you for sure know, climate change, one of them. And but also biodiversity, the extreme loss of biodiversity, the extreme loss of other land uses than urban land. And on top of that, we have a huge urbanization trend. So people move into cities still to a large extent. So we have to actually develop our cities, either expand them, or densify them. And then we have to take care of these planetary boundaries. And this is where, let's say, this idea of UN Habitat, the new strategy of sustainable neighborhood planning, comes from. And also the second rule or principle, which says at least 15,000 residents per square kilometer, which is 150 inhabitants per hectare. But they also say it should also include 40% other functions. And that would actually mean, if you calculate it, that it's 240 people per hectare. And that is the same as if we take a planning term, how we talk in planning about density, a floor space index or a floor area ratio of 1.25. This is, let's say, the planning reaction, or the let's say policy reaction on the issues that we have to deal with. There have also, of course, been a lot of studies in research, let's say in academia. And I would say that one of the key publications is the one from Newman and Kenworthy from 1989. And still many papers, let's say, that are written that talk about density and effects of density. In their introduction, they refer to this paper. And what they showed was the enormous strong correlation between density on the one hand, population, let's say inhabitants per hectare, and energy, transport-related energy consumption on the other hand. And what you see here in this diagram on the left side is you see American cities with the red dots, with a very low density and a very high energy consumption related to transport. And you can read, of course, in this is not only energy consumption, it's also pollution of private mobility, etc., which is linked to this. And then you see on the other end of this spectrum, you see Hong Kong with an extremely high density and a very low transport-related energy consumption. And then in between, you see in gray, you see the European cities, kind of balancing between these two extremes. And this study has been repeated many times and been confirmed. I mean, it doesn't show this was an, we could talk about this and be a bit critical about this study, but it has been confirmed that this correlation is very strong. And we'll get back to this also later. And then besides the UN Habitat guidelines, new models are proposed, and you probably know a few of these: smart growth, transit-oriented development. And you can compare these models with what we had 100 years ago with the Garden City movement. That was also a model. How do we, let's say on a conceptual level, see how our cities should grow? And smart growth says function, let's say mix of functions, high density. So this has a very different sort of principles that lie underneath this concept than what we had in the Garden City movement. So you see that our time sort of gives other answers because we also have other problems than what we had 100 years ago. And in a way, you could also say that what we did 100 years ago has partly maybe created the problems of today, that we have this very low density in our cities currently, that we have these more sprawling situations at times. Sweden is a very good example of that. The city core is very dense, it's very small, and then we have villa areas, large villa areas, which is very car dependent, etc. Let's talk about these density effects in more detail. I mentioned a few, but let's go, let's say, a bit more systematically through that. And what we did, we started in 2018 with this study. And what we did was two things. On the one hand, and the reason that we did this was that we saw that this huge sort of push forward for densifying our cities went very fast. All municipalities embraced it, UN Habitat embraced it. But what you saw in the newspapers, that there was a lot of debate. People are, let's say, are not very, let's say the people living in our cities are not very, let's say, very positive about these changes, because they don't want to have densification just next door, etc. And there were all kinds of reasons that were put on the table why it was not good, and it became a debate of you are either against or you are for. And we thought, from an academic perspective, that's not very productive. So we thought we should do a systematic review of what we actually know. So that's what we did. So we did a systematic review of all the papers that have been written about density and the impact of density on all kinds of things: social impacts, health impacts, ecological impacts, etc. And on the other hand, we also thought it's interesting to look into how actually planning practice, so how municipalities in Sweden actually argue for densification, or maybe sometimes they argue for against densification. But what arguments do they use? So on the one hand, we did a systematic academic review, and then we did also a systematic review of what is planning practice actually saying. And the aim was to identify knowledge, let's say, gaps in both of them, but especially to also identify consistencies and discrepancies, also levels of overestimation or underestimation of the density impact. So maybe practice says it's only good, let's say, for the social benefits of people to have higher density, and maybe research is a bit more nuanced. So also that we wanted to sort of highlight, and also highlight gaps in knowledge, because maybe actually things that are said in practice are not researched at all, or maybe things that we know from research are not discussed at all in practice. So also this we wanted to sort of put forward. This I think I already said, so let's skip. And then the method we used was, so for the systematic review of the academic papers, we used a method that is very much used in medicine. So it's a very rigid way of selecting your papers, screening them first by their abstracts, and then you you can sort of, you have a few rules kind of, or you could say you have factors, let's say, that we have defined beforehand that we follow then in this screening steps. And we did so. We started with 1,200 papers, a little bit more, and through the screening process, we ended up with 229 papers that we have read, and I will show the results of that. And all these papers, so one of our rules is good for you to know. One of our rules was that they should have empirical evidence. So it's not theoretical papers about this. They all rely on empirical observations, and that can be interviews of residents, or it can be, let's say, air pollution measures. So it's always this empirical, actual data that is part of these papers. And then they draw conclusions, okay, how does density impact this phenomena that they have studied? So that was the one part. And then the systematic review of the practice. We used, in Sweden, each municipality has a comprehensive plan, and they have to update that every 4th year. And this is really the document where they put forward how do they want their cities and settlements to develop into the future. It's kind of a long-term strategy for that. So we selected the 16 largest, we all included, and then we did a random sample of 43 other municipalities. And also there we read through this whole document and noted down how do they argue for densification or against densification. And then the first thing, so I will show you the results of that. So the first thing you can see is that, or that you can compare, is which topics are discussed. And you see on the left side is the arguments used. So this is practice, the left side. And on the right side, you see the effects that are studied. So that's what research says. And you see, for instance, that transport is overrepresented in research. So 35% of all the papers, they looked into how does density impact modes of transport, length of the time you spend in different transport modes. While in the arguments that are used, often what we called here infrastructure, so I will tell you what I mean with that. Half of them talk about that. And with infrastructure, we meant, or we mean both, let's say, literally, let's say how much roads do you need? If you build denser, you need in relatively less roads, let's say, to reach all the houses, for instance. And that's one of these things that is included here. But also social infrastructure, so schools, parks, parks, I think also. So all this is also included here. So it's the whole package, let's say, wide definition of what I mean with infrastructure. It's the physical infrastructure, but also social infrastructure. And you see also that, for instance, ecology is very, very little discussed in these documents in practice, while it is studied quite good, let's say. So we know quite a lot, but it's not part of the things that is included in the argumentation for or against densification. If we move on then to look a little bit, let's say, if there are differences worldwide, because our studies, they use this empirical evidence from, it can be from China, from North America, from Europe, and there might be huge differences. So we also looked into that. And here you just see the differences in, here I actually show only that 22% of the papers that we have been reading were from Europe or used European empirical data, so European observations. North America was 38% and Asia was 31%. And you see that there are also a few continents that are not there, like the African continent is not represented, or very little, which is problematic because we know that actually densification is going to very, very fast there. So this is, I mean, one of the parts, let's say, that we also looked into. When you look at the three that we actually have enough papers for, you see also that they have slightly different focus. So you see that the North American studies, they focus even more on transport. You see 50% of the papers from North America are about transport. In Europe, much less. In Europe, actually, the social effects of densification is studied more, while in Asia, health effects are studied more. So there are differences in, let's say, what is sort of highlighted in these papers that we have been reading. If we now look at the real effects, but until now I just show you, let's say, these topics are discussed. But what are the pros and the cons of densification? And what you see here is not these main. Let's go back one. So these 6 aspects that we looked into are the main aspects. So it's this infrastructure that I already mentioned. It's transport, it's economic effects, it's environmental effects, social effects, and health effects. These have, of course, under categories. So you can go much, let's say, we can go within health, it's physical health, mental health. We even made a distinction between health related to noise and to air pollution, because there were many studies on that. So there are under categories. And what you see here are these under categories. And then you see when the bar is in green and goes up, then all the papers that we have been reading were positive about, they found positive results of densification. And you see there are quite a few here. And then you see that there is a kind of here, it's both and, let's say, it's like, we don't really know. We don't really understand this phenomenon. And then you see examples where this is clearly negative. Biodiversity, microclimate, psychological health. On the positive side, accessibility, functional mix, energy, public transport, public finances, property values. So you see there are pros and there are cons, and we can identify them quite clearly. If you read, let's say, the book Space Matrix, we have these, we go through these, we give examples of what kind of, let's say, how to explain a little bit more. For instance, that higher density neighborhoods have better accessibility to public and commercial services. People use these services more frequently, so they are more sort of, they're used more often. And the services provided they were more diverse in what they actually offered. So they're kind of a whole package that has to do with accessibility and functional mix. On the negative side, higher densities do not create optimal conditions for surface water management and are a threat to the provision and quality of recreational areas. There's also a strong consensus of the reported negative impact of density on psychological health. Hence, high density neighborhoods have more people with stress-related health problems and depression. Then there are parts where there is either we haven't yet come to a conclusion. It might be so that it still just needs more studies, and then maybe it becomes more clear that in general, let's say, there is a positive or negative. At times, it also has to do with that they have looked into the question in a little bit different way. But the things that we have a bit of discrepancy is physical health, safety, social equity, and climate. And to give you an example, in cities of higher density, a smaller disparity, so difference, between housing unit prices in the center and in the suburbs was found. So actually it was a quite equal distribution of these prices. However, another study reports that housing affordability decreases when density increases. It might be that housing prices increase in general, so in the whole city, which reduces affordability without affecting polarization. So in a way, people are moved out of the city. They have to go to another municipality or to another city further away. And this is, I mean, London is a clear example. Stockholm is a clear example where this is happening. So it might seem that, we have less inequality, but actually all the people with less money are pushed away outside of the city. So statistically, yes, but actually the polarization takes place on a regional level. So that can also be the reason sometimes that there are differences in outcomes within this category. I will actually move on to manage. Then if I take all these under categories again back to the main categories, and you recall them, it was this public infrastructure, so both roads, sewage system, but also schools, etc. Transport, economics, ecology, social and health. This is what is the aggregated result. And you see that there is in general a very positive impact on public infrastructure. It's resource efficient, it's more accessible, etc. All these infrastructures. Transport is sort of promoting more sustainable transport modes. So we use the car less, we use public transport more, we walk more, we cycle more. All that is, let's say, within this package. Also in economic terms, there is a clear sort of more positive effect than that there are also negative effects. There are a few, you see, but it's still in the dominant side on the positive side. But then we move. Then you see that the dominant bar goes down, the yellow one, which is actually that it has a negative impact on sustainable development, both in terms of ecology, the social effects and health effects. And the positive side here of the health effects is physical health, especially because we walk more in more denser neighborhoods. We walk to the public transport modes, but we also in general walk more, but because things are closer by. But there is a huge negative impact also that cannot be ignored, of course. And that has to do with psychological health, but also with air and noise pollution. If we now go and do the same thing to the arguments that are used in these planning documents that I talked about in the beginning, so these almost 60 municipalities that we looked into in Sweden, and then you see that they have, so the same categories we use to classify all this, and you see that there's actually quite, it's quite the same for most of the topics, except for the social impact. What you also can see is that in general, there is kind of a more polarized, let's say, they are either very positive or they are very negative, while the research results are a bit more nuanced. This is quite common, let's say, this is what we very often see. But the huge discrepancy in the social impact of densification is troublesome. So in these municipal plans, they write, all of them, that they densify to actually achieve a more sustainable development through that there is more social cohesion, there is more well-being, there is people are more happy, all kinds of stuff, let's say, that they say. While actually the studies that we have been reading show quite a different image. So this is something that is really a discrepancy that has to be worked with. And that was my last. I want to show you one more thing before we have a break, and we can have some questions. I have to stop sharing to share something else. Sorry for that. Bear with me. Then we go to this one. Because this, what I showed you just in a minute, let's say in this presentation, was this huge study and its effects. There have been papers written. You can look into the open access book to also read about it. It's one chapter that is about these effects. But we also developed a database that you can use, and this is the database. And what you can do here, you can actually do what we have done, but with a lot of shortcuts. So if you're interested in the impact of density on mobility, you click on this one and you get an overview. You get the text, a kind of a summary of that. You get the subcategories. Okay, for public transport, 88% of the paper said has a positive impact on densification has a positive impact. Then it's travel behavior, car, pedestrian and bicycle, traffic safety. So you can see, let's say, the results, both in these bars, but also in spider diagrams. And in these spider diagrams, you can also see, let's say this is the total, but there might be differences, studies that have looked on the city scale, on the impacts on the city scale or impacts on neighborhood scale. There might be differences. So you can also look into that. And then if you're interested to know more about public transport, you can actually get all the papers that have been that wrote about public transport in relation to density. And you can click on that and you get the abstract, and you can even go to the URL and get the full paper if you have access to it. So I thought this is nice for you to know. Let's say I will share the link so that you can actually go through this yourself and use it in the way you want to use it. And I thought that we could have, let's say, see if there are some questions, and otherwise we have a small break, and then I continue after the break.
Yes, there was one question concerning the link, but you mentioned that you will share.
Yeah, I can do that immediately, actually. Let's see, I go there. I will put it in the chat. Oh, there we have it. I will show you, I will give you another link. Then you also have the website of my research group.
Great.
Here. There you go.
Thank
and
you.
I can also, in the break, I will also put a link to the open access book.
Great.
So that you have it. I have to find it, but then I will add that also.
Other
questions?
Yes, just I wonder, did you make a presentation of your research to practice professions that are in practice?
Yes, in this project, let's say the last one I showed, practice was involved. So we had a few municipalities involved, and there was also a national agency for urban planning and housing, and they were also involved. So I've presented it for them as well. So we have been in a lot of online seminars, etc., to show these results. Yes. And
what the reaction was?
Yeah, I mean, they're quite shocked about this discrepancy with the social impact, and I think, let's say, it's kind of a it has to do with probably with the idea that if you bring people together, that's good, isn't it? But actually, it shows that there is if it becomes too, I mean, it's kind of also a very old knowledge. If a city becomes very, and it doesn't have to become that dense actually, but there is an anonymity that takes place. Let's say that you don't really feel that, yeah, there are a lot of people, but you don't feel any engagement with them. That's what, in a way, these studies, I think, show partly. So and I think also what is a bit confused, sometimes they also, when they write, they might have meant that, yes, you get a more urban life, you get more economic activities and more services to your disposal, and yes, that is true. So all the studies that show that, but that is not the same as creating social cohesion. So I think they're also maybe a bit unprecise in what they actually mean. And we were, of course, we really read literally, what do you write? If it's social cohesion, then we relate it to papers that are about social cohesion, and then you see this discrepancy. So that can also be, some said that, but actually we meant this and this and this, and like, yeah, well, okay, but that's something else. And we have to, and the most important part of doing this research and also trying to get out with it is to actually have this nuanced discussion about densification and acknowledge the negative impacts, because you can do things about it. It's not so that you can actually design your city with this knowledge that this can actually impact social cohesion and design. I have examples in Amsterdam that are fantastic. Let's say that you can create in the middle of Amsterdam, very, very dense. You can create through certain, let's say, designing your block in a certain way that you create this community cohesion feeling within the block. When you go out, yeah, you are in this city that is anonymous, etc. but we have to design it actively. We have to be there, and then we have to know that this is an issue. So that's the whole reasoning behind not knowing that you can also not do anything about it.
Is it any relationship, for example, here in Vilnius, going talks and intentions to fence all these multi-story blocks, housings from Soviet times, like making mini yards for them. But some social scientists say that it will not work because it's just enclosures without any social life inside, and of course it will have a negative impact on the whole city as people getting outside their yards, they just will walk through the fenced fields.
No, exactly. There is a very interesting study. There was a PhD student of mine who studied this, and she found that that was really about the use of the yard and in relation to social impacts, etc. And she looked at both closed yards, let's say the more traditional closed building block in all cities, and the modernistic solution with slabs and which was what was very interesting is that enclosure creates a feeling of belonging, that this is mine, and I dare to leave my things outside, which is of course it's quite logic that happens. The open yards were actually that had much less, but they were used much more frequently. So that was very interesting. She didn't expect that. So these enclosed yards, yes, it felt that what was yours, etc., but the usage was quite low. And then she also looked into the programming of these yards, let's say, and actually what she found was over programming is actually negative for usage. So you have to engage, you have to sort of give the residents, the people, the power to actually decide themselves what they want to do with things. That gave a very positive outcome. So the house owners, let's say, that try to sort of, we have to do things, we have to sort of put all kinds of stuff, and was the opposite effect. The other thing that you also see, which was also very interesting in that study, what we currently see in a lot of in Swedish cities, I know at least, is that you have closed building blocks, but we open them because we think, so you have these paths that go through it because that's good for city life, we think. This had an extremely negative impact on both the feeling of belonging and the usage of the yards. So this was really a no-go area of, in a way. I mean, if you read her results, it's like, don't do it. If you do it, let's say, because you think it's a bit the same as what I found in the density impacts. You think that if we bring people into the yard, it gets alive, a lot of people, but actually the purpose of the yard is undermined. So this is so I can give you the link to that book as well. It's a fantastic book to read.
Yes, please. Would be very interesting. Yeah. It's going on quite tough discussions.
You see it full screen.
Yes. Now.
Yeah. Good. Yes. Okay, so now I will shift from talking about the effects of density to actually let's say how density actually relates to urban form, building types, etc. And this goes kind of back further back in time in terms of my research. So this is what we did first when I did my PhD about density. This is the work I did. And this study that I just showed you about the effects of densification is much newer, as I showed you. And we started off actually by sort of wondering how can it be, let's say, that on the one hand, density is such an important variable or factor when we talk about urban development, urban planning, etc. And on the other hand, we say, as this quote says, that one of the problems is that it has such a weak relation between there's such a weak relation between density and building type. So in a way, it's kind of meaningless, you could say, what this quote says. It's kind of meaningless in terms of what kind of architecture or what kind of built environment we are talking about. And we found this troublesome and thought that this we could do better. There should be a way, let's say, to understand, to be able to relate, let's say, density and urban form in a better way. So that's why we started. I started in a way my whole journey and career in focusing on density. And these are 3 images. And when I have students, I normally ask them, let's say, what do you think has the highest density? And I let them raise hands. And this always gives interesting results. The thing is that this high rise on the left and the very traditional block structure in Amsterdam, they have the same density in terms of what is called floor space index. In American terms, you say floor area ratio. It's the same thing. I'm not sure how you call this. It's the number of square meters of floor space of all, let's say, of these buildings, all the floors added up in relation to the land they stand on. So it's a more the planning term. It's kind of the way when we plan. Often this is what we regulate, and then people start moving in here, and then we can translate this into population density. If we know, let's say, how many people per, if we know the size of the dwellings, if we know how many people per dwelling we have, we could translate FSI into population density. You follow me? So this is the stable one. We could say this is the physical density, and the other one is the lived density when we go to population density. And the plans of these examples that I show you here, they look like this, where you see in black is the footprint of the buildings. In gray, it's the yard, we could call it, as we discussed just before the break. And then in white is the infrastructure, the streets that you need to access the buildings. And they are very differently organized, of course. Here again, let's say I show you a bit, let's say, how density can be measured. So what we have talked about a lot before the break was inhabitants per hectare. What I talk about from now on will be a lot about floor space index. And these can be translated into each other. If you know, as I said, if you know the size of the dwellings and you know the occupancy rate of the dwellings. In between, of course, we could also talk about dwellings per hectare, which is also used quite a lot. So these are the ways how to measure it, but they, of course, kind of relate to each other and are not independent from one another. But we also know, let's say, if you historically, that the floor space index can be very stable, while inhabitants per hectare change tremendously. And I showed you one of these examples in the Jordaan in Amsterdam, where, let's say, in the past, it had 1,200 dwellings, 1,200 people per hectare, and currently it's like, I don't know, 60 or something. While actually floor space index is the same. It didn't change. What we did is, because until now, let's say, if what we have talked about population density or floor space index is actually only one of the ways of describing density. And this is the one that is put on the vertical axis of this diagram. And you see that they fall on the same line, so they have the same floor space index, these 3 examples. But actually, we could also say that density has something to do with how much land these buildings occupy. So the blackness of the pictures here below. And that actually, you can, of course, sort of calculate that as a percentage, where the first one, the high-rise example, has 12% of the land is built upon, while the third example is 45% of the land is built upon. The rest is streets or yards. Another variable which has to do with density, I think you will all agree with me, is the height of the buildings. Often we confuse this with density. Often we think that high, oh, then it's dense, and low, then it's not dense. But I will show you that that's not the case. But we can add, let's say, height to this in this diagram. So in this number 3, the average number of floors is 4. And you see these lines that are here, they actually represent number of floors. It goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, 5, 6, 7 is this example. And then it goes to the example of number 1 with the high rise is these buildings have 13 floors. These variables are mathematically linked to each other. So if I change one, the other ones follow. So that's the reason I can put them in one diagram. And you can also see it like this, that if you want to have the same FSI as number 1, but you want to have low rise, what you do then is you just follow this line and you pass all the height lines, you could say, until we, for example, come to number 3 and we stop here, then we can actually read in this diagram, okay, then I need 45% of my, let's say I have to sort of use 45% of the land. So you can actually also start to almost get your design guidelines through this diagram, and then you start drawing it. Now we do it the other way around. I had examples and I put them in the diagram, but you can also use it in reverse. I will show you a few more examples to just get it to sort of let it land. Here you see 3 examples with the same floor amount of floors. This is all low rise examples. So we have pair houses and villas on the left, number 1. Then we have low rise buildings, but kind of composed in blocks. And one that goes even further, very compact. And then we put them in the diagram. We measure everything and we put them here. And you see, of course, they follow one and the same line here of 3 stories high. So all these buildings are 3 stories high. But you see that the land that is occupied increases enormously. And for that reason, it has the same height of buildings. The one with the most compact kind of form, 40% of the land is occupied by land, can also have a much higher FSI. It's an FSI of 1 in comparison to this first example has like 0.2 or something. So the number 3 is 5 times as dense and the example number 1. And they look like this. And you see the streets are more narrow in this case. The buildings are as high. Another example. And this is actually a variable that I didn't explain, so I should explain you. There is a 4th variable, which is called open space ratio. And all these variables have been used for many years, 100 years. But often independently, and often one disappeared and was not in focus anymore, but actually they are intertwined. Open space ratio is a measure that tells us something about how intensely the unbuilt space will be used. I will explain a bit more. So if you imagine that, take these 3 examples that I show here. Black again is buildings, the gray is the yard, and white is the street. If all the people that are inside of these buildings go out and spread them in the unbuilt space, how crowded would it be there? This is what the open space ratio tells you. So you could call it a kind of a measure of urbanity, because let's say if it's very crowded in public space or in the open space, you feel that you are in an urban setting. So this tells you something about that. It was very often used actually in the 40s and 50s and 60s to actually do the opposite, to avoid overcrowdedness in open space. So there was put a maximum of 1, and that's the reason I put 3 examples where this open space ratio, you see number 1 here, is 1. And that means that you have for each square meter of floor space, so within the building, you also have 1 square meter of unbuilt space. So always if you have let's say you have an apartment of 100 square meters, there will also be 100 square meters of unbuilt space, yard and street to your disposal. If we move up in the diagram and we go to, for instance, to 0.5, then it's like for each square meter of building floor space, you only have half a square meter of unbuilt space. So suddenly you have much less open space outside of your apartment. And these have the same, which is kind of interesting because you would think that number one has much more. But the thing is that these buildings are very high. And for that reason, actually, when all these people would move to the gray spaces, let's say to the outside spaces, it will be as crowded and as in this village. I will show you the images. It looks like this. So although you have a lot of open space here, you also have very high dense area buildings, or not high dense, you have very high buildings. And for that reason, let's say when they would spread out, all of them at the same time, go and stand there on a similar distance, it would be in the same intensity in all three of these examples. Then if you have examples from reality of neighborhoods that are very similar in their morphology, in their building type morphology, they actually cluster in the diagram. And this is the reason that we could start identifying, or sort of we put all many examples in this diagram. We measured them, we calculated them, we put them here, and identified clusters of similar characteristics. So the red cluster here is closed building blocks with average building height, relatively compact, and you find them in all cities. Then we have very compact, so high coverage, high GSI, but much lower buildings. And you find them a lot in the UK and the Netherlands. They are known for this typology. Then we go to the more modernistic areas. They have a rather low coverage, so compactness. It's like 15–20% of the land is occupied by buildings, and average building height. And you find them, all of them here. I have had students in China using the space matrix, and this holds, let's say, independent from where you are. These types of area neighborhoods, they always find their spot in the space matrix diagram in this red area. And then we have very almost, let's say, rural areas that end up in the very left down corner of the space matrix. Of course, I could show you many examples of this, but I leave it at that. And I see that I have actually. If we have the time, and if you are interested, we could look into, because also here actually I looked into, from this perspective, you can also start to look into the effects, not only the effects of density, but actually the effects of this package of density variables, because it might be that if we are we have an FSI of 2, the effects might be different dependent on what height the buildings have. So maybe it's not FSI that actually is the one that sort of pushes a certain effect, but maybe it's the coverage, or maybe it's the building height. And there are very few studies that have been looking into density in that manner, because very often we rely on statistical data that is available, and often that data that is available is population density. So most of the study, I think when we looked into that, I think it was like 70% of the studies use that. And then there are quite a number of studies that use typologies, but those typologies are so crude that they are not so relevant for an urban planning perspective. They use, let's say, rural, urban, for instance. So there are very few studies that look into the details of how actually building types in relation to density have certain effects. And I myself I've looked into a lot into air pollution and noise pollution, because we know that the way we form buildings, let's say if you use slab buildings, without an enclosure of the yards, or we used enclosed buildings, has a huge impact in how air and noise pollution are distributed in the urban environment. I didn't include them now in my presentation, but we might have time, and then I can open it. I have it in another presentation. But I will move on. So now you have an understanding of that density actually has a very strong relation to building types and urban form, but you need to describe density then with more than one variable. Only talking about population density or only talking about floor space index is not enough to understand actually what kind of urban environment we are talking about. Because we can, again, let's say if we, let's go back actually to this all in the beginning where I showed you this one. Let me think now what I wanted to say. So if you want to create, let's say you know that you need to create a certain density. Often, let's say there is an economic reason why a certain density must be achieved, because otherwise the project is not feasible, etc., etc. So there are two things then that I have shown you until now. So one is that you can actually you can use this to go through and see, okay, what are my options? And you see immediately that with an FSI of 2, it becomes very, very difficult to have low-rise solutions, because the lowest we can come is 4 stories high. We could go there, but then it's like you need to have 100% GSI. So the coverage of that land will be 100%, and that's not possible, because then you don't have daylight anymore and you don't have streets anymore. So that's impossible. So this shows you kind of the space of possibilities. If you know your FSI, you can also use it, of course, in various ways. You can also use it in terms of, okay, I know that I want to have low rise. So you just follow the line that I had here. Okay, what are my, I want to have a low rise area. What are my opportunities, and what density or what FSI can I reach with that ambition to have a low rise neighborhood? And that you can actually achieve an FSI of 1 still, which is the same as very many of the modernistic areas. They often do not go over an FSI of 1, which is very interesting. So this is the way you can use it. And you can also then, with the knowledge of the effects of density, you can also start discussing, okay, but what are the implications in terms of, well, economic, social, etc. effects. Let's go to the end and my last part. Now we know a lot about density, and we know a lot about the effects of density, but how much does it actually say about urban life? And I often use this as an example to sort of introduce this. And here we have, this is Gothenburg, where Chalmers is located, the university I work. And this is a part in the very inner, I mean, this is the old town you see here. And here you have a very popular area, closed blocks, a lot of restaurants, a lot of people in the street in summer. And the question is, if we would use all these characteristics of this neighborhood, so we use the same height, we use the same FSI, the same GSI, and we move it to another place in the city. And I move it here, there is a river, and I move it to the other side of the river. The question is, would we get all this urban life? We get the same urban environment in a way, let's say physically, but will it function in the same way? There will still be the same amount of people will live there, but do we get the same activities? And I think you feel it coming that this is another example. We can copy paste. It's kind of an interesting what if scenario. So what if we do this? What can we expect? And the thing is that density is, yes, it's a driver of activities. It's one of the, we have seen that in the effects that you get more functional mix, etc., etc. But actually there's more into it. And my research group has looked a lot into the role of proximity and centrality. And density creates proximity, kind of, because by building things more dense, things become also closer. But centrality is a little bit different because that also depends on how the whole city is structured. And let's take it step by step. So if I until now have talked about what we could describe as area density. So you take a piece of land, a neighborhood, and you calculate the density. This is what you see on the left image, and then we can give it a color. So the higher the FSI, then it's red, and when it's very low, it becomes blue, and in between it's green. But if we would calculate something that we have called accessible density, that means if I start from one address point, one door, I step from my door, I live somewhere and I step out of my door and I walk 5 minutes in all directions. How many buildings and how much floor space do I reach? And that quality you give to that my address. And I do that for every address in the city. Then this map that was shown on the left side, which just showed from every plot what density it has. On the right side, you see the accessible density, and it's a very different image. But this is actually how we experience when we walk through the city what the density is. So the left, I would say, is the planning document. The right is what we experience when we walk through the city. And I can give a comparison. If we look at this example here, number 1, you see it's plots with a high FSI. But if we look at the accessible density, it drops immediately. So this situation is that you have on a very, very local scale, your plot and your yard, it's very high dense. But when I start walking around my plot, my house, I don't reach a lot of density. And that's what you see on the right side. If we take another example, number 2 here, actually the plot has a relatively low density, but if we see the accessible density, it's very high. And we have done a lot of studies. Let's say, what does this say? How does it affect, let's say, the urban life that takes place? Well, in number 2, you can expect all the red, let's say, all the plots with a high accessible density. There are more people walking the streets. There are more commercial activities ongoing, because you don't survive only, let's say, from people that live in your block and maybe sort of use your shop that is in the bottom floor of that building. You actually are dependent on a lot of people, a lot of inflow, others that also pass by locally, but also maybe from a longer distance. This is still quite local because it's a 5 minutes walking distance. But we do the same, let's say, when we look into centralities, and I'm not sure if I will go into that a lot, but we have, let's say, looked into this, that this actually impacts how many people you will find on the street. And of course, you will find a little bit more here because there are so many people living in this number 1 buildings, but there will not be many visitors. So it's only the only feed in, let's say, is the people that live there. And so what we have, I should actually maybe explain a little bit. Also, I could go back to the first image here. So here, what I did here is that both, let's say, I copy-pasted a very local thing and moved it somewhere else. Then, of course, the accessible density would be very different. When I moved it to the other side of the river, you see there are very few buildings. It is an old industrial area. In transformation, currently there is not so much ongoing. So the accessible density will be very low here, while it's very high over here. But there's something else. It's also so that this area is it's kind of, we could call it hidden in the streets network. It's a long distance, not only in terms of meters. If I start here, let's say, to go there, it takes you a long time, and this one is much faster. But also there are many roads that end up here. There are very few roads that end up there. So there's kind of a lack of integration in the city as a whole. It's kind of this system perspective of describing a neighborhood. And that is, if I move on, is what we describe as centrality. And I'm not sure if you know the field of space syntax, but this is what the field of space syntax, which is, you could call it a branch of urban morphology, studies. It studies how the configuration of each place in the city as a whole affects the use of that place. It helps you to understand where you are in the system, and the system can be a neighborhood or the city as a whole. And the combination of these two, density and centrality, we have found has a huge impact on mixed use. Only one of them doesn't do the work. It's both of them that do it. And they do so not because they create a high level of pedestrian intensity and co-presence. So if you have a high density and a high centrality, many people are in the street. And that creates opportunities for services, for public transport, etc. And we have done this study in, I'm not sure if it's in a huge, let's say, pedestrian survey that we did in Stockholm, in Amsterdam, and in London. In each city, we had 20 neighborhoods, and in each neighborhood, we calculated data in 60 streets. So we had, let's say, an enormous amount of material to show how this centrality and density affected pedestrian movement patterns. Why you have in one street so many people and in the other street so few. They can be very close to each other. It can be the main street and the back street of a block. Why are the differences so big? And that has to do with centrality and density. And this comes, let's say, from a theory that is kind of old now, from Bill Hilliard, which is called the theory of natural movement, which we, through this study, proved. And let's leave that. And there are other ways, let's say, to study this, which one of the PhD students in Delft, when I still had connections there, or I still have, but then I was active also as a supervisor, he showed here that how density and mixed use related. And what you see here is when you are in this part of the diagram, you only have amenities. If you are here, you only have housing. If you are over there, you only have offices. And in the middle here, you have a mix. And then the mountains in this diagram, and the color red shows when there is a high density. And you see very clearly that in most cases, the high density is in the middle of this graph. And if you go to the edges, the density is lower. And that's the way, of course, we plan partly, but that's also the way how the nature of, let's say, it's kind of logic that if you have a higher density, there's more opportunities for mixes of uses. And then, of course, there are exceptions. We sometimes plan a very high dense neighborhood with only housing. But if time goes and if the regulations allow, then you will slowly get other activities moving in if the density is high enough, if the place is very central. And there, I think that was my last slide. Here you see the book that I already sent you the link to. So you can both buy it. It's a physical book, but it's also open access, and it's published in the open book. I don't know how they call it, but it's from the TU Delft. So the university in Delft that has this repository, and you can download it there. And then I also added a lot of links to papers if you're interested to read more. So I can share this presentation with Ida later, and then she can spread it if you're interested. And let's see if you have questions, and if you are interested in to see something of the things that I didn't show that I just mentioned, let's say. But I stop sharing first.
Sorry. Thank you. Very interesting and inspiring presentation. And I guess, and I hope it will be very useful, because we also have among us representatives from various municipalities.
Very good.
Yeah, I think they will have use of your knowledge. I don't know if I have to post, there were few questions beforehand, and I'm not sure if it's relevant to your theme, but still, one interesting question: what is your opinion about the impact of consumption on urban growth and density?
Oh, then I need to know a bit more what question. I mean, I can interpret it, of course. Let's say I think if we translate consumption in let's say in consuming resources, then there are and if we then there are different things. I would let's focus on I will take it, let's say, from the things I know something about. So if we talk about resource efficiency in our field, then it has a lot to do with both energy consumption related to heating, cooling, transport. It has to do with land. It has to do with infrastructure and that kind of things. And actually the studies that have been, so this review that I did of the effects of density are very clear that the higher density is in many ways resource efficient. We also know, as I showed you, there are, let's say, drawbacks from densification, but this is very clear that it helps us to be economic with our resources, which we should be in let's say, the sustainable challenges that we face. So because of the negative side of densification, move away from densification is not the right answer. The right answer is actually to try and mitigate, do something about these negative impacts. And that's my research currently is going very much into that direction. So we are trying to tackle health and ecology by looking into the combination of densification and greenification, and see if if we can find proof that there is actually, by combining them in a smart way, that we can actually tackle some of these negative impacts of densification. Because we have done densification, of course, without really considering these negative impacts. We just sort of went for it. So, and I'm actually quite convinced that you can combine.
And maybe before our participants will post their questions, kviečiam labai klausimus rašyti čate, jeigu nedrąsu užduoti, arba tiesiog užduokit klausimus, lektoriai, tikrai pasinaudokite proga. One more question. You also quite a lot of research is made in connection with greenery in the city. And to your view, it's, I guess, happens everywhere in the Europe, at least, when too much constructions in the name of densification are going on in the city, and what's happening with greenery, even if there are green areas in the center of the city, but they are overpopulated, overused as a threat for greenery. And is there a way how to compensate this pressure?
No, so this is an issue, and all the studies show that this is a problem. But there are two ways. Let's say there are two things I would like to say in relation to this. One is, of course, that not densifying and urbanization takes place anyhow means that we will expand our cities, and that also will cost green areas. So there is no way out, let's say. So the thing is to do it wisely, and to look at both what qualities this green area has, which can you, should you really be very careful with? Which can you, so we have to be much more sort of knowledgeable in, let's say, where to do it, instead of, let's say, finding the easiest way out, or yeah, you just had this piece of land and then we can build there. No, really go to, okay, but what qualities will disappear then? And that's both inside the city and outside the cities. Then I think that the way we distribute green areas plays an important role, both, let's say, for recreational purposes. So if you, instead of having, let's say, small parks everywhere, maybe it should be a chain of green areas that can actually make that you can move through and you get different types of activities. And I think that will help partly this overcrowdedness. But especially, and that's what I'm looking into a lot now, it's extremely important for biodiversity to have connected green areas. And we also know that biodiverse green areas are very beneficial for our health. It's not just green areas that do that job. It's actually the green areas where we can relax. And we can relax in areas where it gets this natural natural wash, or I don't know how you can call it, let's say. And biodiversity is kind of an indicator. In those areas you have that. So what we try to do now, I have a current study we just started, and we are going, instead of measuring where people walk, we will actually start measuring where different species are in cities, and then look into the effects of quality of green, connectivity between green, centrality, density, and see if there are actually combinations that work. Are the thresholds? So really to sort of get an understanding of this.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, we have a question. Oh, question started to come. Okay, this is the first one is, good day. In Lithuania, usually the conflicting comments against density are that it decreases the quality of life in regards. Oh, no, I need my. Yes. So it decreases the quality of the life in regards with being too close to your neighbors. What are good arguments for density when talking with communities? How to explain benefits of density to the public who never wanted to be close to others?
Yeah, I think it's more nuanced than so. It's not not wanting to be close to others. I think you want to be close to the people that you can have a kind, they don't have to be friends, but you can have an relation with. So the most extreme is, of course, that we all live in towers and we only have public space. You go in the street and there's not only your neighbors, but it's, let's say, everyone is there. So you don't have a clue. You don't have a clue who is your neighbor. So that's a very extreme example. The other extreme example is you live in a very small village and you know everyone. Let's say it's a very, very sort of a community that everybody knows everyone, and you and most of the things that we have in reality is somewhere there in between. And I think that what we should become better on is to create this kind of village-like communities within the dense cities. And there are examples of that. And that means that you have to create I actually think what it is about, it is a diversity in this centrality that I talked about. Let's say you have this main street, the urban bus that goes on, then you take a turn to the left and another turn, and then you suddenly are in a square, which feels, I mean, you have all experience, I think. It feels like you're in a very local community suddenly. But we are not very good in designing that. We tend to design currently grid cities, which never create that, because then you create equalness in all the streets are like the same main street, and some become more or less. But actually we can create this huge variety in how many in intensity of both density and centrality, so to speak. So in my studio, this is what I train my students. How do you create this? We can design it. It's not so difficult, actually.
Yeah, maybe. I would like to see such decisions. Another question. I'm wondering if in your studies on urban proximity, there were cases that could not be explained by either density or centrality, but require other variables, for example, urban aesthetics, number of entrances, amount of greenery, etc.
Yes, of course. I mean, so urban aesthetics we don't look into. Of course, it matters. Let's say I'm not saying that that's unimportant, but that's not that's not the thing that I research. And I think also that aesthetic cannot solve these more structural characteristics. But without aesthetics, the structural characteristics, let's say, are kind of, they don't do all the work. So you need both. I mean, obviously. We looked into many other variables. I would say that the number of entrances, for instance, is one that we always include also. Amount of greenery we have looked into. But what actually is interesting that we have been very long time in being mainly interested in to understand the intensity of people in the street. Because we know that is the reason for many other processes in cities that take place. For that, actually, it has been shown that centrality and density are the main variables. Then what I'm doing now, let's say looking into other questions, greenery will become more and more important, I'm sure. So it depends which question you have, of course.
Yeah, maybe greenery as concerning impact on health, psychological.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
One more question. Most of the time, people living in the area are against local densification because they are used to live in their usual environment.
Yeah.
Do you see any means by which the opinion of these people could be changed?
Now, I think here, let's say you could use the same, so these effects of densification and the database that I shared with you, in a way, there are pros and cons. And I think also for the neighborhoods that you are doing this, you have to inform them. And you should also inform them how you will handle these negative impacts, what you will do about it to make sure that that doesn't occur. So I think it's really, it's being very professional about this is what we are doing. We have reasons to do this. It has huge advantages. They will profit from it also because they will get more access to public transport. They will have more functions in proximity, etc. There are advantages. There are also disadvantages that you have to sort of give kind of compensation for, I think, not in terms of money, but in terms of that you maybe invest in a park that is nearby. So that, and the thing is, the interesting thing is that I work quite a lot with the National Traffic Agency in Sweden that sort of is responsible for the big infrastructures, but they also go through cities, etc. And they are very good into understand the ecological impact of what they do. And there's how it impacts red listed species and things like that, especially outside cities. And they're very keen on that. So they have the whole, they do analysis and they invest a lot to actually mitigate or to compensate the loss of this red listed species somewhere. So there's a whole, let's say, way of working that has been there for many years. We don't have that in urban planning and design, which is a bit strange. So my proposal is actually to start by talking about advantages and disadvantages, also to be able to start talking about compensation measures. So that's the way I would go not talking about what negative impacts are is no good way to convince people, because they know. They read. They can also go to the database and read. I mean, they know, or they have ideas that you can actually help them to, let's say, by showing the whole picture, convince them that, well, we know that there are these advantages and disadvantages, and this is our reasoning. Let's say, I think it's that's the way to go.
Oh, thank you. Totally agree with you. And the next question goes like further on. Did you observe in your research what is an impact of densification on people involvement of city co-creation?
In city co-creation?
Yes, people's involvement.
Ah, yeah, right.
Participation, like.
I have not been involved so much in co-creation processes, besides, so not with citizens. I do a lot of projects with municipalities, with developers, but not with. We have other groups, let's say, at Chalmers, that do that a lot. So I haven't. I have no, let's say, own experience with that. So what I just proposed, I haven't tested. But it also, because before you go, let's say, to co-creation with citizens, there is a whole co-creation process with different actors in the planning process, which needs the similar approach. And there, that we have tested. And there we actually also, we often use their also spatial analysis to actually show what the impacts are. Not only, let's say, because we have read something in a paper, but we also, okay, if you have a new infrastructure here, you create a barrier, the accessibility to green areas will be diminished. To put all those facts, let's say, through spatial analysis on the table. So we have maps that we bring with us, and then we talk about that with these actors. So that's the way we go with it, but that's a more professional, let's say, that's the professionals doing co-creation. It's not with the citizens. But I think you can do similar things with citizens, actually, both with maps that showcase and what I said earlier, the knowledge that we have about impacts.
Great. So we're going beyond. If there is any more questions, we're I just think, Tinetta, great thanks for your lecture.
It was a pleasure.
Your knowledge. Yes, I hope that there will be. We will spread your knowledge even more after your lecture. So we're saying farewell to you, and just we'll share and the screen, and we'll talk about our next lecture. Tai sveiki, grįžtu prie lietuvių kalbos ir baigdami šią paskaitą iš karto pristatau sekančią ciklo paskaitą, kurią skaitys architektas urbanistas, ilgametis Vilniaus miesto vyriausiasis architektas Mindaugas Pakalnis. Ir suprantama, jis daugiausia turi žinių apie mūsų sostinę. Skaitys paskaitą Mindaugas, kam reikalingas miestų tankinimas, Vilniaus atvejis. Jis nori šią iki šiol gan tabu laikytą temą išviešinti, pakviesti diskusijai, ir jis taip pat pasidalins ne vienam duomenimis ir statistiniais ir kitais. Tikrai bus labai naudinga šitą pamatyti ir rasti kažkokių naudingų žinių savo, tai kviečiu registruotis. O dabar